Society of Antiquaries of London on Wednesday, 12th of February 2025 at 5 p.m. The President, Ms. Natalie Cohen, was in the chair. Dr. James Wright presented a paper of In Search of Britain's Oldest Pubs. Questions were asked by Grace Iopolo, Natalie Cohen, Neil Hanrahan, Natasha Bilson, and Faith Acker. The President and membership thanked the speaker. The meeting ended at 6:15 p.m.
If everyone is happy, I'll sign the record. I know. So we just have an announcement this evening before we start on the main event with our lecture tonight, which is that we have just had a council meeting this afternoon, and we are looking for volunteers who might be interested in being a council member for the Royal Archaeological Institute. So we have one space available that we need to fill, and we're looking for expressions of interest from our membership. If anyone would like to join the council, we are lovely, obviously. The process would be, if you would like to express an interest, to just get in touch with our manager, Sharon, with a couple of lines as to why you would like to be on the council for the Royal Archaeological Institute. So you know what you might be letting yourself in for. It would be for a 3-year term on council. 4-year term on council. I know how long it is, honestly. And we meet 4 times a year. So March, May, October and December. Okay. In the meantime, while we're just sorting out the tech, I am happy to answer any questions that people might have about council membership, or alternatively, break into a small song and dance to fill some time while we get this up and running. We're all good? Excellent. No need for my tap routine then, what a shame. It is my great pleasure to introduce this evening's speaker, who's Dr. Hannah Fluck, who is our Senior National Archaeologist for the National Trust. So I have the great pleasure of working with Hannah, not nearly as much as we would like, I think, on a day-to-day basis, but it's a real pleasure to have her here with us this evening. So Hannah formerly worked at Historic England as the head of environmental strategy, and her expertise is in the area of climate change, archaeology, environmental archaeology. So we couldn't have asked for a more expert speaker this evening on the subject of archaeology in a nature and climate crisis. So I shall hand over to Hannah. Thank you, Hannah.
Thanks, Nat. I'm not going to lie, there was a bit of a moment when we realised that there was very few means to actually share the presentation that was on my laptop, but it looks like the tech god smiled on us. Gosh, I'm not very good at standing still, so apologies if I go quiet. But I always have my backup of my objects so that I can talk without slides at a given moment. So if I start waving things around, that'll be why. Yes, so I wanted to talk to you today about the way that we can think about archaeology and being archaeologists in the context of global nature and climate crises. I realise that at the moment the world's a pretty miserable place, and I really don't want to add to the general doom and gloom that we might all be slightly feeling. So I'm hoping that rather than leaving you a little bit overwhelmed and miserable and feeling like you just need to sit in the corner and drink a gin, you might feel inspired and engaged and feel like being an archaeologist in today's world is a really good thing and we've got a lot to offer. So let's see if I can achieve that. If not, I've got top trumps that we can play in the pub later over that gin while we cry. I've spent the best part of the last, it's probably 10 years thinking about archaeology and the historic environment in the context of nature and climate. My time at Historic England, I also worked internationally, helped found something called the Climate Heritage Network, which was trying to bring together experts in the historic environment and cultural heritage, indigenous peoples, all sorts of cultural expertise, bring that to bear upon the climate crisis. With National Trust at the moment, I work more on the nature side of things, looking at how we can improve our wider landscape and the environment to address the nature crisis, but most importantly, the way in which our expertise as archaeologists and the way in which we can understand the world around us can help us do that better. There's a number of strands to thinking about this that I've sort of come to different ways of sort of breaking it down. One is understanding the risks and the impacts to heritage, and those are both direct and indirect, the things that the climate is doing to our planet and also the things that people are doing in response to that. But there's also the ways in which the historic environment in particular and cultural heritage more generally can facilitate that mitigation and adaptation. So mitigation, when used in the context of climate change, means the reduction of greenhouse gases. It's the action to reduce greenhouse gases that are causing climate change. Adaptation, the things that we do to respond to and adapt to a world with a different and changing climate. Now, obviously, that's a little bit different because in the archaeological world, we use mitigation in very particular ways, mitigating the harm that might occur to archaeological deposits and sites and to the historic environment as a result of actions that are taken, sometimes in response to climate change. So if I'm getting confusing in the way I use the word mitigation, call me out on it. So but just be aware, I'll be probably using it in both senses. Also, in the way in which we can facilitate nature recovery, we are one of the most depleted nations for nature on Earth. This is a really big issue, and we do need to respond to it. And those of you that have seen the most recent National Trust strategy that we launched last month, I think, restoring nature is up there front and centre with the activities that we know we need to undertake. And more importantly, what I really want to do, this is what gets me out of bed in the morning, is looking beyond that idea of how we can conserve heritage, look after the historic environment and reduce the harm that comes to it from the decisions that people might make with regard to those other aspects, and see the historic environment, heritage, archaeology as proactive players in how we respond to that we've got something really positive to contribute. The challenge is huge. I really like this waves. You've probably seen variations on this with the idea that you think you've got one crisis, but looming behind it is yet another that's even bigger and more obliterating of the other. And in that context, archaeology starts to look a little bit out of place, perhaps. I know I've had a lot of conversations, particularly with younger generations of archaeologists, who are saying, well, actually, should I retrain? What can I do as an archaeologist to help in this world? Is it just something that's nice to have? Should I rethink? So I'm not sure that we're going to get swept away by those waves, but it sometimes feels like that. So with facing existential crises, so how do you make that case? How does archaeology matter? And just in case that doesn't depress you enough, it's all right, this is the low point. We will cheer up after this. I've been collating the things that people have said to me in the course of trying to do my work. So I quite often find myself as the only archaeologist, the only person that understands or even cares about the historic environment in the room, with people who are trying to achieve what they see as more important projects or deliveries or deliver different matters. And they've said, these are the sorts of things they've said to me. Heritage, it's just about old buildings. Those are bad for the environment. So, you're not really helping. My favourite one, and this was a bit of a penny dropping moment for me, but if I can't see it, why does it matter? How can it be so important? And actually, as an archaeologist, you're like, oh, man, that's quite critical, isn't it? Like, we're talking about a lot of the stuff that we care about are things that you would not know were there. And it's quite a reasonable question to ask. It's all about innovations and modern technology. What we did in the past has caused this. Why on earth would we want to look there for any solutions? Another one that really cut me quite deep was it's just opinions. You don't really have any data. So that was quite painful. So this is the kind of context I think it's worth bearing in mind, that when we're talking about trying to undertake archaeology within this context, this is what we're up against. This is how a lot of people are viewing the world, and it's not up to them. They're not going to suddenly go, oh man, what I really need is an archaeologist. Where are the archaeologists? That's just not going to happen. But that doesn't mean that we're not relevant, we haven't got something to offer. But it is down to us to make that reach out and try and make that case and understand perhaps the perspectives of some of these other people. As I said, there's some common themes there. The past isn't relevant. We can't keep hold of everything. Things need to change. Misconceptions. So, one game I like to play is when you're talking to people about the past, or someone uses the word historic, ask them kind of what sort of time frame are they thinking about? I'm not going to play the game here because you're all people who are au fait with the past. But if I give a talk to a mixed audience, there are often people put their hand up and say, are you comfortable with 10 years? Is that a time frame? 50 years, 100 years, 1,000 years? And usually you're just left with one or two. And there's always some smart-ass geologist going, yeah, 5 million years, billion years. But these things matter because people use those words in relation to the historic, to the past, to heritage, quite differently. And historic activities have harmed the environment. That's something that's said quite a lot, but what time frame are people talking about? So, and then I said I've got the game for the pub. It's always top trumps. I do have Indiana Jones top trumps. I can thoroughly recommend them. But a lot of us that work in these worlds where archaeology meets other disciplines, there's a lot of this top trumps, but actually my stuff's more important. So against that backdrop of a nature and climate crisis, is Indy going to beat the red squirrel? I don't know. I mean, I'd like to think he would, but it's also not about that. It's about looking at how we can look for those shared interests and work together. So I want you to bear that in mind as I talk about some of the sort of examples and the challenges that we're facing, and think, is that addressing some of these themes? So something else Nat mentioned, I used to be head of environmental strategy at Historic England, and this lady, Eche, she really struck a chord with me when I very first started that job. She was working the Climate Change Committee, the Adaptation Subcommittee, and she took some time out to help. I wanted some advice. How on earth could I get people in that Climate Change Committee to think about the historic environment? It wasn't really featuring. There was something about risks to iconic sites, and that was it. That was as far as it had got. And that was despite really hard work from colleagues over previous years. And she said something that really stuck with me since, and I think it's worth bearing in mind, that often the thing that's most important to you it doesn't really matter to anyone else, and you're not going to get anywhere if you just shout louder and louder about that thing. What you need to do is understand the thing that matters to the people you're trying to connect with and build out from that. And that's really hard because I'm a Pleistocene archaeologist, so I like the really deep stuff. I like pointy rocks. I like stuff that most other people don't really care about. I kind of learned quite quickly, I think, that a lot of people find that not terribly interesting. It's a hard lesson, but when you're really desperate, you're really passionate about what you can do, and you want to help people share that enjoyment that you have for the historic environment. It's quite hard to think about dressing it up in something that they might be more interested in. But that doesn't mean that we don't matter and we aren't relevant. The other thing, and actually this very cartoon was shown at one of the meetings of the Climate Change Risk Assessment Committee, working on the UK Climate Change Risk Assessment. As an illustration, we were all from all different disciplines. I was sat next to someone who ran prisons for the Ministry of Justice. There was someone else who dealt with Network Rail, someone else dealing with utilities. We were all from very, very different backgrounds, but thinking about climate risk. And he showed the chap running the session showed this Gary Larson cartoon of what we say to dogs, and used it to illustrate how we might all be talking really confidently about something, and someone else might be nodding and sitting there going, yeah, okay, but have they actually understood what it was that you wanted them to understand? And that lost in translation is something that I think goes back to some of those comments that people were making, the misconceptions. So I'd like to talk about how we can create babelfish. Most of you hopefully familiar with Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, but the babelfish is the thing that you stick in your ear so you can understand other languages. And I think that's also really, it's really important before you start trying to bring the relevance of what we know and how we approach things to bear upon these challenges. So going back to that kind of list of the things to do with climate, the first one, understanding climate risk. So actually, one of the big hooks for getting heritage and the historic environment better recognised within discussion about climate change was being able to articulate the risks. And for a long time, we could say, well, coastal change, things are going to fall off cliffs. And then people go, well, how many things? Where? And actually, climate change isn't just about sea levels rising. It's about temperatures increasing. It's about changes in rainfall patterns. It's the stability of the ground beneath our feet, the shrink swell of clay soils, the slope stability, surface water flooding. So actually, this was before I worked with National Trust, we were collaborating. I've got all the collaborators there on creating mapping, which is hosted. The QR code will take you to the interactive map, which illustrates the climate risks for the UK that we felt were pertinent to the historic environment. And they show some quite scary changes. And that underpinned and is still underpinning subsequent work on looking at exactly what is at risk, where is it at risk. And so anyone can access that information. It's a baseline point of understanding. So for National Trust sites, we've got more than double the number of places that are at risk from climate-related hazards by 2060, and that's just over 30 years. That's quite a shocking amount of change. So we need to then think about how we're going to respond to these risks, if you understood them. And this is quite a well-known example. I think it's quite well publicised, the excavations at one of our hill forts in North Wales, Dinas Dintley, in Gwynedd. And the excavations are capturing the stories and the information of that site before it falls off the cliffs. And that's quite and most people can understand, this is the mitigating of harm in an archaeological sense. You've got something that's going to happen. So we would go in and excavate and understand that before that information is lost. But as you'll see, there's other ways in which we can build on that work as well. It's a brilliant example, and I think they've reinstated the excavations are complete, and you can still see one of the hut circles has been left exposed for people to enjoy. We've got a lot more information on this. The QR codes will take you to the relevant reports, but last year, National Trust published a Climate for Change adaptation of the National Trust, which included a number of stories about places and how they are responding to those challenges. So the impacts and the issues vary from the living heritage and the trees, in particular in this example of Chirk Castle, which are at risk from climate-related hazards, including extremes of wetting and drying. And everyone, most archaeologists know when trees fall over, they can take large chunks of archaeology with them. So we tend to not want them to fall over, as well as the trees being heritage in their own right. And the estate's looking at how better to manage more proactively those trees so that they don't fall over so much and they can survive better. Blickling Estate has suffered from water-related issues hugely. And there's a lot of work going on to better understand how water works in that landscape to be able to manage it better. And a lot of times for our places where you've got water-related issues in the landscape, we know as archaeologists, people are really ruddy good at moving water around, right? But most people think that rivers might have been a bit straightened, and that's what people did. I come across that a lot with environmental colleagues. What we know is that people shifted rivers sometimes by miles out of their route and did some really quite dramatic things to them. And people really genuinely don't understand how long ago that was happening and how extreme water management was in the past. So that better understanding of water management is quite an important thing to help inform the decisions that we make about how to manage water in those landscapes today. And another part, the sort of collaborative work that related to the risk map that's evolved quite a lot, is hosted on the International National Trust Organisation webpage, is this Introduction to Climate Change Adaptation. And my colleagues are working through the different categories of assets or issues that are being affected by climate change and trying to pull together information, advice, recommendation on things that we can do to help respond to and adapt those places to those climate risks. And this is a really lovely project that Imogen Wood and Catherine Shingler, colleagues of mine, were working very closely with the International National Trust Organisation on a project called Withstanding Change. It's funded by the British Council, DCMS, through their Cultural Protection Fund. And it involved, in part, twinning National Trust places with partners in the Middle East and Africa. So one of the things that I learned in my time with the Climate Heritage Network, working and sharing understanding with colleagues from all around the globe, was that sometimes these issues feel really place-specific. They are really place-specific. Climate change is a global challenge, but the way in which it manifests itself is very local and very personal often. But that doesn't mean that we can't learn and share from each other in places that might, on the face of it, seem like they have very little in common. And I think this project's really been a wonderful opportunity. There have been exchanges, visits between the locations, and people managing those places, the people managing those properties and the communities have learnt a lot from those conversations about the different and innovative ways in which people are tackling those. And I think there's more to come. Some of the publications are being pulled together on that, so watch this space for more on that. One particular issue, now I'm really aware that later on this evening there is a further conversation happening at the Royal Geographical Society about trees. And I spend quite a lot of time thinking about trees, and I think it's quite an interesting topic for us archaeologists to focus on. And I saw I'd never seen it before, this cartoon with someone instructing someone to plant a tree on what clearly is an archaeological feature, even if they haven't noticed it. Now, I think it was an illustration of bad gardening, but actually it's quite a curious, sort of illustrates both the nervousness that we have about planting trees of archaeology, back to that why does it matter if I can't see it thing, but also that cartoon's there because that tree isn't going to grow very well if it's planted on top of a wall. So actually, sometimes what we know about where the archaeology is going to affect whether those trees survive and do what we hope them to do. But I've learnt a lot about trees, including the fact that if we don't plant trees, we aren't going to meet the obligations or the commitments or the need that we have to reduce our carbon emissions. And I think a lot of people, I certainly spent a long time thinking, well, what about natural regeneration? And surely we can just, let these trees grow in other places. There's an awful lot of research now that shows that we really do need the additional carbon sequestration of those trees to get us over. I think it's in around, the next 100, 150 years before we can be fully transitioned to a low carbon, zero carbon ways of living. So it is critical, and we do need to be able to accommodate those. And the right tree in the right place is great for habitat, reduces all of those other kind of carbon, climate-related risks as well. And National Trust, as you probably know, has a considerable ambition to plant 20 million trees by 2030. I think the new strategy is going to be upping that a little bit as well. So Nat and colleagues, myself, spend a lot of time thinking about how can we help people think about where those might go and how can we share that information to help that happen. So this is one of the ways that we've been trying to look at how we can inform those decisions at scale, translating some of our data. So some of you might be familiar with historic environment records. We have our own record of the historic environment, because we're not a planning authority, so it's not an HER. It looks like all those dots and splodges, the green thing on the left is basically what we know. Now, that's kind of informative because you know that something's there, but you don't know how much it matters. You don't know how sensitive it might be, particularly for things like planting trees. So we've been trying to find ways to convey to our colleagues the sorts of questions that they need to ask. We're sort of thinking of the stop and think maps, where you might think about what you need to do in order to understand how and where trees might fit in that landscape. It's not saying they can or they can't, it's just saying, please stop and think. Red means really stop and think, because there's something really important there. And we will be sharing this with colleagues to help inform those decisions. So it's just a different way of presenting that information. But there's also a lack of understanding, and I suspect that the meeting later on this evening will be looking at this, in part, I think, in some of the outcomes of this report that was commissioned by the Forestry Commission, that concluded that actually we don't have sufficient understanding, we don't have much evidence for the different ways in which different sorts of trees in particular are actually affecting the archaeological record. And I'm quite a fan of being able to make evidence-based decisions and not just making assumptions. And I think it's interesting that as archaeologists we do know that often earthworks and features will survive better in wooded areas. Now clearly that depends upon the management, a whole host of the history of those places. But if we could better understand some of the relationship between planting, then as more and more places get planted, perhaps we can fine-tune some of our requests on how the management of those places might look. And this is a particularly, I found this really quite interesting and quite exciting. Now the project, we've been working with Sam Turner and Tim Kinnaird on their OSL sequencing. So looking at how we can understand the stratigraphy of earthworks to sequentially, to understand the sequence of earthworks in the landscape. They've been using it for field boundaries. In this instance, it's a hilltop. It's a site that was purchased thanks to donations from local society in part, and it contains lots of lumps and bumps, which are really cool. Probably prehistoric was, I think, where we'd got to. They wanted to undertake work, partly to test this technique, but also to help us date and understand the age of those. And what I found really interesting, and Sam has, I don't think he thinks I'm mad, but I was jumping up and down going, but this is really cool, because what you've done is dig a trench in a wood. It was covered in rhododendrons. The rhododendrons were cleared before they excavated the trenches. It's planted as a sweet chestnut coppice, I think, in the 20th century. But you've managed to successfully put a trench in where the stratigraphy is still intact to such an extent that you can get successful OSL samples and sequencing from. And that goes against a lot of what we think trees would do to archaeology, and I find that really interesting. So at the moment, I'm not sure what we do with that, but just to flag that actually sometimes challenging some of our own assumptions is part of our approach. And then I said I'm going to use this word mitigation in lots of different ways. So I guess this is beyond mitigation in both the climate sense and the archaeological sense. And this is another example from one of our estates near Exeter, and design of a community orchard, where early archaeological assessment of that landscape not only enabled trees to be planted in an area that was quite rich and interesting in archaeology through that better understanding, but helped to inform a design that really drew on the story of that place, engaged communities with that place, built a place that they could feel connected to, and helped inspire that design that was delivering benefits for nature, sequestering carbon through those trees, and also connecting people. So it's a nice example, and we're starting to see an awful lot more of that, where the benefits of that early investigation are really informing the design. You can see the sort of initial design, it was quite blocky, general, lots of areas, we'll put a lot of trees in here. That detail that came out of that archaeological assessment alongside other assessments started to refine it. You end up with much more interesting and developed landscape as a result. Something else that you might have seen, I must admit, when I first joined National Trust, I was in a meeting about blossom, and I thought, where the hell have I gone? This is insane. I've gone from the world in which you're trying to remind DCMS to think about the historic environment in a whole host of ways to people wanting to talk about blossom. And it was a little bit of a shock, but I've sort of understood a little bit more about it. And it's a really interesting way that it came out of trying to re-engage people with the natural world, thinking, the beauty of blossom, that sort of really simple connection that most people would have. But we've been working with a number of partners, and in particular, Tom Dommett, who's our head of historic environment, has been leading a lot of this work, to look at things such as the loss of hedgerows in our landscape, the loss of orchards, that traditional tree presence, that it's not just about woodlands or plantations, but when we're talking about introducing trees to places, there's lots of different ways to do it. And most recently, I think this was probably about this time last year, we did some research which shows that a third of hedgerows on our land had gone, and not on National Trust land. It was more than 50%. And that traditional orchards, had decreased by over 80%, which is a huge loss. And I think something that really got people thinking about whether that is a way in which understanding the past can start to inspire some of the responses that we can make to the contemporary challenges. Of course, hedgerows are also really important for connectivity for wildlife. An awful lot of our ecological species are species of woodland edges. They really like hedgerows, provide almost an ideal habitat for an awful lot of things. And that long-term presence of those structures in our living structures in our landscape, all the soils and the botanical interests and the genetic diversity that you get with the plants and species within them is also really important, very much living heritage. And reinstating hedgerows where there used to be hedgerows, or indeed ponds where there used to be ponds, you can sometimes really capitalise on that ecological memory of those places and those features. So it's not just about reinstating and recreating a historic landscape, it's much more about using it to frame a new living one. Place names work as well, something else that's really crucial for sort of hooking and identifying places where there might have been some of these floral places. And it really engages people, that's the other thing. People find it inspiring, and it can be fun. Another thing I spend an awful lot of time thinking about is peat and peat and heritage. And we all know peat is brilliant at preserving really extraordinary remains. I think we've all marvelled at the discoveries from Must Farm and looked on in envy at the incredible finds they've had. And they're just endless examples of really wonderful things that are preserved. But it's also incredibly important for sequestering carbon, water quality as a habitat, as well as preserving the paleoenvironmental deposits, as well as the archaeological deposits. But if we don't look, it's a bit like it's a kind of knife edge. When it's well looked after and in good condition, it's great. When it's not, it's really, really bad. It's a net emitter of greenhouse gases. It's not just sitting there doing nothing. It's actively emitting greenhouse gases when it's in poor condition. It's eroding, and it will contribute to poor water quality, and it's not doing any of that conserving of paleoenvironmental material and archaeological information. And within the National Trust, I was a little bit astounded by this, but apparently our peatlands hold 2% of the carbon in the UK in both the peat and the vegetation. So, I didn't think I'd animated that one, but yes. So things have changed as well. I worked on the England Peat Action Plan along with colleagues trying to get that recognition of the relevance of the historic environment into our approaches to restoring peat. And there has been a bit of a shift from a kind of opposition of, could you just leave that there because that's got precious archaeology in it, to actually recognising if we don't look after our peat, then that precious archaeology is gone. It's not a leave it and it will be fine situation. And we've been doing some work, so this is a really lovely example of work that our colleague Shannon Hogan's been leading, and Angus have been leading in the east of England with Cambridge University at Wicken Fen. So Wicken was, I think it was our first nature reserve. It's a really fascinating place. It's a little remnant of a biocultural landscape, the reed beds that were only there because people were using reeds. And now, in order to manage it today, we have to imitate what people in the past were doing to manage those reeds. It's also incredibly important because it's a little island, seems the wrong word for somewhere that's wet in otherwise dry land, but like the reverse of an island, a wet thing. That if we can look after that, then we've got the core of that ability to regenerate the fenland for that area. So it's critically important, but it's also really challenging to manage and maintain the water levels. The other thing is that these sorts of wetlands, you end up with places where you actually don't know what the archaeology is. So it's not a million miles away from Flag Fen, from Must Farm. It's in that east of England area where we know it's just chocker with really interesting things, both beneath the peat, within the peat, and on top of it. And no one's really looked because it has been a nature reserve and preserved for so long. So Cambridge have been working with us to do test pitting, to do coring, to start using volunteers, engaging the community in that process to really look at what we can learn about the environment as well as the archaeology there. And one thing that I'm realising is that a lot of the time these techniques, these paleoenvironmental techniques, they're things that we apply when we want to know more about a particular site. You find something really cool and you go, right, we're going to do paleoenvironmental work to contextualise what the people were doing at this really cool archaeological site we found. And actually, one of the things I've started asking is, what if we kind of flip that and think, as archaeologists, we will view the environmental information that comes from even a single core. We can tell a story. We can link the changes that you're observing to what we know is happening elsewhere within that landscape. And what if we were to start to do that, not just because it will contextualise cool archaeology, but because it starts to tell a story that helps people understand the relationship between people and those places, between people and the environment, between people and those natural processes that ecologists like to talk about over time. And does that help us? Does that help people understand why things might need to change now, or indeed how we might want to change them? So this is, I'm going to say Nat, people can ask you about this later, because this is one of Nat's. But the other thing that we have that's really, one of the really special things about working at National Trust is we have incredible places, and these places are not just one thing. We get to think about them holistically, and we get to think about how archaeology can support work that's changing places at really quite a scale. And I think Winchelsea and the project that Nat was telling me about at Winchelsea is one of those where that understanding of the history of such a complex and wonderful place really needed to happen to mitigate the harm to that archaeology, to ensure it's conserved. But it's also, in doing that, you're telling the stories about that place. You're helping inform those decisions in ways that aren't just don't dig a hole there because we'd like to preserve it, and inspiring people to think differently about their environment. And also, sometimes contributing to innovative solutions as well, those things that people might have done in the past that we've forgotten about. And we've got the archaeological evidence to see whether they worked or not, and if they didn't, how they didn't. One of my favourite, there's some good examples of that from Environment Agency work on coastal management, where you can see Roman attempts to manage flooding which have failed, and you can think, well, actually, we can learn from these. And I know from Environment Agency archaeology colleagues that they've had conversations with engineers where they've gone, that's why that's not happening. Or you find the medieval culvert that no one really remembered was there, and no one thought to ask the archaeologist, but the archaeologist can say, oh, yeah, no, you know that river, but you don't know where it's gone. Well, monks did something daft with it, so that's why you might have flooding problems, that kind of thing. And it inspires people, as I say, to connect. I'm hoping that clock up there is correct. If it's not, someone shout at me. I used to always end with Lego, but I decided to do something a bit different and throw it in the middle. And Neil, I know, is at the other event down the road, so isn't here to answer himself. But I unashamedly stole, those of you that know Neil Redfern, you might have seen his Lego movie talk, and I gave it a bit of a climate and nature twist. So the Lego movie, obviously you've all seen it. If you haven't, you are now going to go and watch it. The story of the Lego movie goes that you've got the main character, Emmett, and then there's the bad guy, the Kraken. Now, the Kraken's actually the dad. The dad is gluing. You get a kit, you build the Lego kit, and then you play with it, and sometimes bits break off, and then it becomes something else, right? That's how you play with Lego as children. Not with the Kraken. So this child's dad glues the kits together, and there's a room that the child isn't allowed to go in and play because he might break the Lego, and he's controlling it. So you build it a very particular way and you fix it. Now, Emmett, the main character, eventually becomes the kind of ideal accolade is to be a master builder. So he becomes a master builder by learning. You learn to build certain set things in a set way, and then eventually there's a moment where he's seeing all of these options and possibilities in the ether, I guess, and then can somehow battle the bad guys with this incredible master building skill. And the theory goes, or the analogy goes, that are we perhaps a little bit like the Kraken? So we've got all of these amazing skills that we hone through doing our Lego kits in particular ways within our disciplines and sub-disciplines as archaeologists and historians and historic environment experts. And actually, it's really hard sometimes to think about how you might break some of those up and do something a bit differently. But the Lego movie is saying, you don't know what's going to happen. You're going to respond to these novel situations using the skills you've learned by building the kits, but without applying the glue, so you can adapt and respond and build something that will fight the bad guys, or in this case, maybe climate change, rather than being fixed in our ways. And then I had a conversation with a very senior former colleague who should probably remain nameless, but buy me a drink later and I'll tell you, who said, isn't it annoying when your kids get older, like they just want more and more complicated Lego models, and I've got to stay up all night building them before birthday or Christmas. What? So, I don't know, I mean, maybe some of you do this, but the horror that you would buy a Lego kit for a child and build it yourself. I mean, you at least pretend that you're helping them when you do that, right? You let them open the box and read the instructions. But this person thought that that's what it was. It was like just an IKEA kit for a toy. I was like, wow, that's somehow even worse than the Kraken. And then I was thinking, well, is that also a bit like us, where, you know, we better do it for you? And that's probably, I think for me, that's where it gets a lot harder, is how do we let go a little bit, not be the dad doing it for someone else, and share what we know and how we understand the world. One of my geography colleagues calls it Hannah's deep time goggles, the archaeology goggles, but how can we share some of that and empower other people to become master builders and to use what we know to be a bit creative? And that's underpins a lot of how I approach working with some of our nature colleagues. So how can we be more Emmett? So those of you that haven't seen the movie are now obviously going to go and watch it. So this is now a kind of trial run or introduction to something that I think of a bit. So what we're trying to do, I guess, at National Trust is build a bit of a Lego toolkit, be more Emmett, with a bit of a Babelfish. I'm not sure what a Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy Lego movie mashup would look like, but I'm sure it's somewhere in production. So we've been thinking about, and this has been triggered by recent funding calls for landscape recovery schemes. These are massive, massive schemes funded by DEFRA, huge landscapes, delivered over 20 years, bringing together a lot of the other aspects of funding. And there is a hook, thank you Natural England, for the historic environment within that. And there's another hook for communities, which anyone working in heritage would go, oh yeah, we do people, we can connect with that. But the challenge is, what happens if you start to ask, what can we do to help when it's not our problem? So before someone's asked and said, we want to do this here, can we do it? If we could get in there first and say, right, we know these things, is that useful? And present it in a way with our Babelfish and thinking about some of those questions with a sort of language or in a way that resonates with them. And we're right at the beginning of testing this, and we're working with all sorts of partners and commercial archaeology units and others to talk about it. We're going to be running a bit of a session at the Chartered Institute for Archaeology conference as well, which will draw on this a bit. So so we developed this heritage impact and opportunity. The word scoping was in there, so it read HIOSA, but I feel like that was not necessary. But heritage impact and opportunity assessment, basically, where we tried to articulate what we wanted archaeologists to do to apply what they knew to someone else's knowledge. This side, I've regretted putting this slide in, but I couldn't really find another way. So don't feel like you need to read it all, which is also something that no one should ever say when doing a presentation. But the idea is that instead of really focusing on that mitigation of harm, that I sometimes think of it as a apologetic archaeology, where, like just don't spoil our stuff and just stay with your stuff. I just would love it if we could be a bit more proactive, positive, maybe. So it's about, actually, I know things that mean that there are opportunities to do things that will help what you're trying to achieve. Sequestering carbon, looking after nature, allowing nature to recover, restore itself. These are important things that we need to share. There's another cartoon of the various variations on the people never learn from the past, and the people that learn from the past are doomed to watch other people not learn from the past, or words to that effect. I feel like that was a little bit too close to given state of the world today, so I didn't want to include that, but it's along those lines. And there's some key points within it, that it's about presenting information in a way, it's that Babelfish of what other people need to know and understand. It's addressing the objectives of the project. It's not our object, it's not about us. It's back to that thing that Eche said to me. It's not about us, it's about them, but that doesn't mean we're not relevant, but it is our job to make that case. How would you address delivering nature recovery in this landscape as an archaeologist? What are the options? What might be there? It also, and this is another really fun thing, is that I've realised we're talking to a lot of colleagues that other people, other disciplines are really struggling to think at that scale. One of the objects I bring with me is a map, magnifying glass, but the idea of thinking at different scales, teasing out a story or an understanding of a place across the entirety of a national park area, for instance. Now, as archaeologists, we can do that. I mean, some better find it more comfortable than others, but we are quite good at teasing out threads of complexity, but into a story that we can tell. And other people really struggle. So that's a very genuine offer that we can make. And that idea of a golden thread of a story of people and their environments over time. I get to use an object now. I sometimes talk about the need for us to tell story. What we're doing now is writing the next chapter in a story of our landscapes. And you wouldn't write the next chapter without any reference to what had gone before, not unless you were a bit weird. So the book I use, I found this in National Trust bookshop. It's Doctor Who and the Pyramids of Mars. So this might be stretching the storytelling that we can do. Yeah, maybe. But the point is that we provide those previous chapters, we provide that context. Yeah, you can read the other things on there that are relevant. But the idea is that it's sort of shifting the focus of what we can do. And there's probably 6 key features to it. One is that narrative, that story, and setting that scene. And the point is, it has to be accessible. It's not the sort of death-based assessment in the Paleolithic people were doing this in this place, and it's of national importance, or they weren't, or it's not a kind of chronological. From our perspective, what is the story you want to tell other people about that relationship between how people were using and working and shaping that environment? The other is it has to address the objectives of that project. It's not about our objectives. It's actually about what is somebody trying to do with that landscape recovery in this instant, and how does what you know going to help them achieve that? The opportunities and what might be needed to realise those opportunities. So we talked a bit about the lost woodlands, lost hedgerows, ghost ponds, those kind of things. What might you need to do as an archaeologist to help people understand where those things are, to understand what they might be able to tell you that might then inform how you might be able to reinstate those within the landscape or use them to inspire future action? Visual summaries. People really respond to mapped information. They don't respond to the splodges and dots of our record of the historic environment when it's not been filtered. They do respond to maps that are telling them the sorts of things that you want them to know. And those opportunities for access and engagement is really important for us as a National Trust. We're trying to end unequal access in our latest strategy. So the historic environment's full of ways of bringing people in and connecting them with those landscapes, both physically and remotely. And then the other thing is a plan with recommendations about how you might undertake that. But most importantly, those benefits, the public benefits, the benefits to whom that you might get if you did those particular things. This is an illustration of the different ways in which we might filter. And one of the things I've been playing with, so that's our initial information on the left, then sort of filtering by time period, so you get a kind of chronological story. Thinking about what other people might want to know, so that, can I see it? Well, not if it's hidden below the ground, but these things you can. These are the sticky up lumps and bumps, the things that are surviving as earthworks, or physical upright features. And then finally, something I'm just going to talk briefly on before I wrap up, archaeological features as potential for supporting species or habitats. So not even for our interest. We know that a lot of places are going to be really rich for and important for different species. One of the things is the Roman snails that we have at Chedworth Roman Villa, for instance, but we have instances where there's really particular collections. So what if we were to map our places and offer them to ecological colleagues and say, have you looked? These places might be really helpful for these species, rather than avoid these things because they're special and they're ours and we don't want you near them. We might be able to offer something helpful. And so that mapping of the kind of sensitivity that I showed you a bit early on, if at the same time as offering that, saying, be a bit careful here, there's some really sensitive things, we are also able to offer a map of those things presented as the sort of habitat they might present, is that might help soften that. Be really careful here, but we could help you deliver all these cool things. So we're just playing around with that at the moment. The previous map, I think, was bryophytes and lichens, and mosses and lichens, which are going to love any exposed stone or sediment that's particularly old, and we happen to have quite a lot of that. So if we think about how we can present that. Yeah, that's more of the same. I've realised I'm waffling on a bit. And this is what it looks like behind the scene. I'm trying to structure our database. And more importantly, we're structuring it in a way that fits with all of the standard data that other people use. So every historic environment record in the country will be using the same thesaurus, and we will be able to share a spreadsheet that will link that. So it won't just be something that we can do for our places. It'll be something that anyone can have and play around with. So when it's ready, we will be sharing it. So to wind up, we've got various tools that we can use in our toolbox, and all of those help us challenge and those misconceptions that were reflected in some of those comments at the beginning, contextualising the change that we've experienced and we know has occurred. Archaeology is really a story of change and changing relationships. We can inform better decisions, ones that serve our purpose and help conserve the things that we care about, but also making better decisions for those places, understanding that ecological memory, the cultural memory of those places and how that's reflected in what is there today. Supporting that innovation, relearning things that we might have forgotten, and really importantly, inspiring and engaging and weaving that story of people, reconnecting nature and culture and the sort of the connections that we sometimes lose when we're sent off playing top trumps. Oh, why have I done that? Oh gosh, that's a bit weird. I don't know how to undo that. Anyway, the conclusion, gosh, yeah, no, that's not going to happen. Oh, yeah, there you go, okay. Is be a bit more Emmett. And just my final artefact is my favourite example and a little warning. So my husband gave this to me for Christmas. If you can see, it's an archaeologist trowel, 4-inch welded hard steel, old school trowel. And some idiot has put a little notch in it. Now that notch is intended to be a bottle opener. Now, all good archaeologists know that you can easily open a bottle just with a trowel. You do not need to ruin a perfectly good tool by adding a notch to it to turn it into a bottle opener. So it was clearly not made by an archaeologist. So it is possible to overthink things sometimes. So while we have a lot of our toolkits, sometimes thinking about the obvious and really understanding not to over-invent or overthink is what we actually need. Thank you.
Massive thank you. Apart from the trigger of showing a page from our HBSMR, which has just made me think of all the database work I'm going to need to do.
I lifted the lid. I put the lid back on again.
Yes, put it away. Put it away. Do we have any questions for Hannah this evening? Everyone's not feeling too upset or unhappy, though, I'm hoping.
I can put those quotes back up if you want to get people really riled.
It's a slightly random question, but
I love random questions. Go
is
for
there
it.
anything? Is there any thought going into the risks of wildfires from all the tree planting?
Oh, it's an interesting one. Yeah, so we've got research on wildfire, which I knew slightly more about. I think there is. I also have a friend who happens to specialise in wildfire and trees for forestry England. So I think there is research going on. I think the risk of fire is just increasing. We know that risk of fire is increasing anyway. And I think it's one of those areas where there's a lot of active research and learning to be done about what it looks like to manage that. I think also we know that I'm pretty sure most wildfires are started by people. So there's a big human component to it as well, which needs addressing rather than just spontaneous combustion or lightning strike or things. I think the vast majority of fires are. So, yeah, maybe something addressing that. But the impact on heritage, I always think Fylingdales was one of the ones where there was all the incredible rock art that was discovered, but also you've got the harm. And actually one of the things when managing wildfires is, going back to that point about information, is what do you want people to know? Because one of the ways you stop fires spreading is digging fire breaks. So it's quite important that you get information to the people that are responding so that actually they're avoiding known archaeological sites and not causing harm when they could have just dug a trench. That's almost slightly different. And I know there was a project, when I was at Historic England, there was some work going on to ensure that information was getting to first responders as well. So I think that's also something that people are aware of.
Thank you. And a second question, if I may, was are there any opportunities for financial opportunities through carbon credits if you're able to sequester carbon through peatland restoration or tree planting?
Yeah, so again, I know colleagues are working on that, and actually I'm involved in a project with Oxford Archaeology funded by Historic England on biodiversity net gain, which has not really included heritage. So it's looking, I think there was a questionnaire, if anyone spots the questionnaire going around, circulate it and do respond. But yeah, there is, and actually a lot of the green finance is going to be addressing a lot of these changes. The challenge is how, and I have another variation of this talk where I look at point out that actually the frameworks within which you're working are not, it's not MPPF, it's not planning tight regulations. The ways in which the archaeological work is secured through these is not that simple, and it isn't as robust as you might expect for development. And so that's definitely the case when you're looking at green finance. We've got which is another reason why approaching it from what we can do to help then helps secure that recognition of the historic environment, and then enables, when people are more aware, they tend to be more willing to accommodate it. So it's another sort of political twist to that.
Thank you.
Did we have, there's another hand up. 4? No? No. I don't have any questions, if that's all right, because it was a bit, it was useful to know what I should be doing at work, which I am doing, so that's okay. But yeah, I mean, Hannah mentioned the project at Winchelsea, which is a really lovely example of that kind of joined up nature recovery, and we do have a big heritage component that's working hand in hand, so it's been really nice to see those examples where it is, you know, we are able to run that golden thread, as you say, and make sure that all of these things are working together in an incredibly significant historic landscape, which is undergoing massive, massive change at the moment. And I did actually stand right on that muddy track that you showed earlier on Friday last week, actually, to look at the new hedgerows. So,
And those are hedgerows that are going in where there were previous hedgerows? Or
yeah, so in some cases where there are previous hedgerows, in some cases where we've got banks. So a lot of it is around creating wetland environments, some tree planting and some orchard planting as well for blossom. So yeah, it's a really, really interesting project with highly significant archaeology all over the place, and finding more of it actually as well as a result of the project. So outside some of the scheduled areas, we've now got much more information than we had about the archaeology previously, because we've been able to commission lots of geophysics. So there's lots of heritage gains as well as natural environment gains.
Yeah, we had, no, at the other end of the country in Attingham, the work that was done with it, we had a very big geophysical survey undertaken there, which a few eyebrows were raised at, but that was because they wanted to undertake whole property scale change, planting lots of trees. The mapping that we had large areas of sensitivity, and they're like, oh, I'm not sure, how are we going to get those trees in? Well, actually, if you take a look at the whole place, then you can start to plan a vision and a plan and approach to it. And I think they found 6 Roma villas and goodness knows how many other settlements. And now there's plans to weave archaeology into a new outdoor hub. There's even an archaeological job that's advertised at the moment to review community investigations. So we've found consistently when properties, quite places, people from thinking about things from a nature side think, oh God, I don't really want to talk to you because it's going to be a pain, and we think about it. And this is about nature. It's not about you. It's about nature. When you, going back to Eche's point of making that connection with the things that interest them, and you get your foot in the door, and then you show them what archaeology can do every single time, they say, oh, that was fun, can we do some more? Or kind of, that was really interesting, I can see how that relates. And we've seen that lots and lots of different ways, time and time again. Just need more money to do it.
Yeah, and around creating environments that people want to live in as well. That's been a really common theme with some of the community work that we've done in Winchelsea, is the benefit to the local community of living surrounded by National Trust estate, which has got all of this important work going on for nature conservation, and the archaeology is an added bonus essentially. But it's about creating a lovely environment that people want to live in, spend time in, all of that. So
yeah, thank you very much. That was really enlightening to think also what can heritage and archaeology do to positively contribute. And I wonder what I've been working on and thinking about is not just the tangible remains, but also the practices, and how people are, for example, using a landscape. And it strikes me that the trust with the property that you have and the holistic approach that you can take, is this something you're working on as well, like engaging the community and recreating ancient landscapes that work within a circular, processes that can also allow increased biodiversity or, use of less pesticides or fertilizers and so on. And that then also can teach people something for their own gardens or their own wider agricultural purposes. So in that sense, also working on the intangible side of the heritage that is inherent in your estates or something.
Yeah, I mean, it's really important. I would love to say, absolutely, we're doing that, and I can pluck off some examples. I suspect that within individual places, people are, but I think it's, I did some work on dry stone walls, and actually, I know there's a report coming from DEFRA looking at the value of investing in dry stone walls. They're almost the ultimate circular economy. You don't bring any materials in and out. The stuff's there, it falls down, you repair it. A well-made wall will last 100 years before someone needs to do it again. And the habitat and the ecosystem services and the benefits that come from those are considerable. And I think there's sort of some thinking about that idea of vernacular heritage being more than just the buildings, its entire landscape, the materials and that relationship with them, and we undoubtedly have lost that. I think there's an awful lot more we could do. There is work, there's various places where the traditional skills and practices are understood, and actually, I mean, at Wicken, the cutting of the reed, now the sad thing is I don't think it gets used, so that kind of scrutinising where we've got a break in that circular economy, I think would be really lucrative. If anyone wants to give us some money or come and do some research with us on that would be brilliant. But, yeah.
I think there's also a lot of work going on with tenant farmers and looking at the relationships that we have with people who manage our land and how they farm. Yeah. So looking more actively for tenant farmers who are going to manage the land in a way that works for nature. Yeah. That's been a big strand actually of what's been happening with the let estate component. So
yeah, absolutely. And actually, I mean, the place names are often a link with that, and we have got some work with the Place Name Institute. It's Nottingham University, is it? England Place Name Centre. But how place names can help farmers understand past uses of their landscape and some of those things and the intangible heritage that might have been lost, and it's quite a helpful way to have those conversations. So yeah, definitely.
Okay.
There's another.
Was there another hand?
No. Okay.
No. Lovely. Okay. Well, I think it just remains for me to say thank you once again, Hannah, for a really fascinating talk this evening, and also just to give notice of our next evening meeting, which is on the 9th of April, which will be a presentation by Simon Marcus from Museum of London Archaeology on excavations on the A428 Black Cat Road Scheme, which has revealed some really exciting discoveries, particularly for the Iron Age. So we hope to see you all again then. Thank you all for coming. Have a lovely evening.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.